Hello, and welcome to the Global War on Terrorism Memorial podcast hosted by the American Legion. I'm your host, Jennifer Ballou, and it's my honor to welcome you home. Today, we are joined by Elliot Ackerman. Elliot is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels 2054, 2034, Red Dress in Black and White, Waiting for Eden, Dark at the Crossing, and Green on Blue, as well as the memoirs, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan and Places and Names, On War, Revolution, and Returning. His books have been nominated for the National Book Award, the Andrew Carnegie Medal in both fiction and nonfiction, and the Dayton Library Peace Prize, among others. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, a senior fellow at Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs, and a veteran of the Marine Corps and CIA Special Operations, having served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. Elliot is also the co-chair of the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation's Design Advisory Council, which we will certainly talk more about. He divides his time between New York City and Washington, D.C. Elliot Ackerman, welcome home.
Thanks for having me, Jen. And thank you for reading that long bio. I'll do a shorter one next time. Sorry about that.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. So thank you so much for being here. You know, I was reflecting on when we first met, and I remember, I think it was about 2 years ago or so, but you graciously hosted myself, Rod, and a few others at your home for dinner. Do you remember that evening?
Yeah, of course. That was a fun event.
You were such a gracious host, and I remember sitting at the table listening to you and Alex Hernandez, another one of our Design Advisory Council members, talk about war stories, and just thinking like, wow, just wow. What do you remember about that night?
Well, I remember, Rod convening all of us, and I think, yes, swapping stories and, a sense that this was like a nice little way station on what has been a long and rewarding journey trying to, get everybody included and involved in building this memorial. So I remember being just sort of a nice check-in. I'd heard about you from Rod for a long time as well, so I was excited to meet you. But it's a real honor to get to participate in the building of this memorial, to meet all of the people who are coming together to do it, and that just sort of keeps growing and growing. So I just sort of, when I think about that night, I think about that as sort of being one of those nice touchstone nights in this process.
Absolutely. And we'll certainly talk about that process in a little bit. But before we do, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with our listeners why you decided to become a Marine.
Oh, geez. I like to joke that I studied English and history in school, and there's only 2 things you can do with that. You can become an English or a history teacher, or you can become a Marine Corps infantry officer. So I did the latter.
Okay.
But in all seriousness, I think I grew up abroad a little bit, so I think kind of being an American outside of America and that being a formative experience for me gave me kind of a little bit of remove from the country and really made me want to give back, kind of give me some perspective that, America's a pretty special place. So that was a part of it. I think, I was a Marine officer, and the idea of having a lot of responsibility at a young age and, really mattering, that if I was good at my job or bad at my job, it would really matter to the people I was working with. That appealed to me, and I couldn't think of anywhere else where, 22 years old, they put you in charge of 45 people, and, the Marine Corps, like the Army or like any of the services, they give you a lot of responsibility young, and that appealed to me. And I think the last thing was I was this like, I always, I was like the kid who never stopped playing with his GI Joes. Like I always had this fascination for all things military. And so when you combine those 3, it led me into the Marine Corps. But I came in So I did ROTC, and started in like the late '90s. And so in the kind of the time that I was in my ROTC training, we went from a peacetime America to a wartime America because 9/11 happened. And so that very much sort of changed just the tone of what my service and all of us who are in the war on terrorism generation, what our service would mean going out for the next couple of decades.
Mm. Yeah, as you were thinking about that, when you said that you did ROTC in college, it kind of made me think about, you know, how different or maybe not it was back then to join the military versus now. And I'm wondering, Elliot, like what would you say to a young person who is considering joining one of the military branches?
Sure. Well, I'm very fortunate. I have a lot of young people in my life, so I actually get to have this conversation quite a bit. Um, I mean, the first one of the things I often find myself saying is, really be honest with yourself about, sort of, your motives for why you want to serve. And not that there's one set that's a correct set motive and one that is a incorrect motive, but it's important to sort of understand that, to understand sort of, what is driving this decision, why am I attracted to this? I think that's really important to just be self-aware about that, and then to have sort of clear expectations of sort of, what do I think this is going to be like? And then to adjust those expectations along the way. Um, my expectations, for better or worse, were very, very different. I sort of, and I'm being candid here, I was coming into the Marine Corps sort of 1999, 2000, nothing really big had happened in sort of America sort of for a while. And so I think, like probably any, wannabe infantry officer, I very much was sort of hoping to see some type of action if I served. But my sense of that was like, wouldn't it be amazing if like I got to go out and, evacuate an embassy somewhere or do a, humanitarian aid mission somewhere, something that was real. And then sort of, at the beginning of my senior year of college, 9/11 happened. And then suddenly everything became very real. And within a period of about 2 years, it went from, a peacetime Marine Corps to really a full on wartime Marine Corps. And that was an expectation shift, just in that, sort of I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll evacuate an embassy to, no, you're going to be, leading a rifle platoon in sort of high intensity urban combat, and that is going to be your military experience. So I think for what I say to a young person is, you understand who you are, sort of, have a sense of what your expectations are. That's healthy. But then also know that your expectations, they can change in a second, and you always need to be prepared for that.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of just things changing, like I mentioned at the beginning, when I read a little bit of your bio, you transitioned from the Marine Corps to the CIA. And I'm curious if you would talk about that transition. And then I'm going to ask you about the transition and how it was different from the CIA to being a civilian or a veteran.
Sure. I was at the CIA for a relatively, short period of time, and I sort of viewed that, I was a Marine infantry officer, then I was a Marine special operations officer in the Raiders. And then what I did at CIA was very similar work, in special operations there, and working with indigenous units. And so the work was actually was pretty similar. I mean, different in a lot of ways, but there was quite a bit of overlap. So that didn't feel like a huge transition. And a number of the guys I sort of worked with at the agency were guys I'd known in the Marines who transitioned over there as well. The one thing I will say that was a real, and it started kind of my having to change my mindset on a few things, was I remember very early working on the agency, I went into the office of our deputy chief of operations, who sort of would keep the schedule of where everyone was deploying and when. And he sort of told me, well, Elliot, this is where you're going to go. This is where we have you slated on the schedule. Blah, blah, blah. And then he looked at me and he said, are you all right with that? Does that work for you? And I sort of said, excuse me? He was like, does that work for you? Like, you got family, does that work for you? And I was like, yeah, I guess it does. I mean, and it was only, I mean, the units I worked with, I mean, they were very, they're paramilitary units, and everyone was there as a military guy. But it was this one little wake up call where I was like, suddenly, I went from being you know, the conversation, as you know, you always have in the military, you're a minority shareholder in your own destiny, right? You have 49% of the say, but the Marine Corps always had 51% of the say for me. And it was just this little tweak where it was like, no, you actually have 51% of the say now. If you say this doesn't work for you, I mean, it doesn't help, and you want to always do what you can, but they'll say, okay, well, you're a civilian now, and so it doesn't have to work for you. And that was a little bit, I think, of a transition for me, understanding that that shift had occurred, that I had a sort of a sense of agency over my own life as a civilian now, that when I was in the military I didn't have, and candidly, sometimes that can be daunting because it forces you to ask the question, like, wait, am I okay with this? Like, is this actually what I want? Um,
Right.
and that only heightened, when I left government service altogether.
Right. And so how was your transition different when you left government service altogether?
The analogy, Jen, like people will often, and actually young people will often ask me about this because I was very fortunate. I got to work with some like fantastic people when I was in the military, and I got to do some what I think are pretty cool things. And sometimes young people will ask me like, why did you leave? Like it sounded like it
Yeah.
was what you were doing was really cool, and I was like, it was really cool, and I was working with great people. But the analogy I kind of come to is like that when I was, that at least for me, being sort of an infantry officer, being in the military, it was kind of almost like being a professional athlete. And I think some of us might feel that way in our careers. Like there are some parallels of being a professional athlete. So like when I was in the Marine infantry, let's say it's football, right? That was like playing a high school football, right? Like you're all out there. It's like love of the game, particularly if you're a Marine, like your equipment's often not that great. Your team's a little scrappy. Some guys are super talented. Some, maybe not as talented. They ride the bench a bit more, but you make it work, and you're just, and there's a real purity to it. Then when I went to the Raiders, it was like playing college ball. You had like everyone on that team was pretty good and was really there for a reason. You had much nicer gear. Maybe you had like a little Nike swoosh on your jersey, and and every now and again, like your games might even wind up on TV. And then when I was at the agency, to sort of very high end unit, I mean, that was like being in the NFL. Like I would look down my office, the other guys I worked with, and they all had I knew who they all were. They all had reputations. There was a real all star team. You had the best equipment, all of the top resources, and you were going up against the toughest teams out there. The targets who went out after were quite frequently, very high end. But at the end of the day, you are still playing football. Like it is still kind of the same game, more or less. And so, you then ask yourself a question like, well, like, do I want to play football for my whole life or coach football? Like, do I want to be inside football? And a lot of people who I love dearly, great mentors of mine, who are still mentors of mine, like their answer to that question has been an unequivocal yes. And they have made huge contributions to the realm of national security over the years. For me, when I was sort of in my early 30s, I kind of landed, I was like, I don't think my answer is yes. Like there are just really a lot of other things I want to do. As much as I have loved doing this, like I know that I need to leave now, because if I don't, the longer I stay, the more difficult it's going to be for me to kind of go out and do some of these other things. And that was a big jump for me. And candidly, very disorienting, a little bit scary. You are certainly given a very clear sense of yourself, a very clear identity when you're in the Marine Corps, or in the service, and you have a very strong, at least I did, I think, a very strong sense of community. And so I sort of left to go work on a project that's sort of an entrepreneurial political project. I didn't totally know what was on the other side of that. All I knew was I didn't want to do this. Maybe it's the only thing that I did with my entire life, and I had other interests. So I went out and I, started this other job, and it was great, but I knew it was sort of only to last for a couple of years. And then on the side, I kind of quietly was, trying to write a book, and I thought I would only write one book, and that sort of took over my life.
That's amazing. And gosh, I feel like we need a whole other episode to talk about that particular like chapter of your life. But if I may, I kind of want to shift to your role as the Design Advisory Council co-chair for the memorial, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial. I'm wondering, just again, for the listeners who might not know what that means. Like, what does it mean to you? Like, what is the role of the DAC co-chair?
This memorial is, a collection of viewpoints and voices and perspectives, and it's only going to be, as I think as good as inclusive as it is. Meaning we don't want to miss anyone. We don't want to miss any type of uh, perspective that can add to the value of what this place is going to be. So I view sort of my role in the work I've done with you is to corral those voices, to look at those perspectives, to have our perspective sort of, challenged. And then once that's been aired, to sort of help hone all of those viewpoints into a coherent design that is saying something. It can be a place that that people go to, and a place that place where people can find meaning for what their experience is. Because every person's experience, I just gave you sort of a version of my experience. It's just one person's experience. Everybody has been so different. So how do you make a space that's going to resonate with all that diversity of experience?
Yeah, that's very well said. So, what does it mean to you? Like, if you take a step back and you think about this role that you're playing in creating a piece of American history, what does it mean to you?
Well, memorials, they tell a story, and again, they're places where we go to find meaning. But everyone's meaning is going to be a little bit different. So I think often a memorial will it will say something, in the way it's constructed, the way it looks, and it will say it will say one thing, and it will say sort of a whole myriad of things. But it's trying to take in the design and in the process of listening and including people, trying to take all of those voices and put them into one coherent statement. And that's obviously a physical statement. It's an artistic statement that makes everyone feel as though they're, that memorial is a place where they go and they see themselves and they see their experience reflected in the space on the ground. And that's a challenge, but it's a process. It's not just sitting around and going in a corner and, looking at a bunch of sketches and saying, oh, we think this one is good. It's getting out there and listening to people and having people talk about when they imagine a memorial, what that means to them. And once you've gone through that process, then that gives you the ability to sort of look at the options out there and find one that will resonate, to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. So, you've shared a little bit with us about you and your background, and I'm sure you have many different experiences that have shaped not only who you are today, but that have influenced your voice as the co-chair of the Design Advisory Council. And I'm wondering if, like, there's one story or example that maybe you didn't recognize would impact this role today, but as you look back, you're like, wow, that probably happened because I was eventually going to be here.
Well, the way I got involved with this, with the War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation initially, I actually feel it was less as a veteran and it was more as a writer. I knew, because I write books, but I also work as a journalist. I knew that the legislation was going through Congress to make this memorial, and I thought it was a fascinating prospect because we now are creating a memorial. And one of the challenges was, the war on terrorism hasn't ended. So how do you create a memorial to a war that hasn't ended? And then I thought the idea was very interesting that, war, the act of war, is one that we as human beings are perpetually engaged in. So in some ways, making a memorial to a never-ending war is almost like making a memorial to war itself. And I was like, this is a really interesting challenge, just philosophically. So I wanted to write about it. And the idea I came up with, I said, well, one of the things that had fascinated me was that in small communities all over America, people had just gone ahead and made their own memorials to the war on terrorism within their communities. And there's a long and rich tradition of that. And you go through small town America, you'll see everywhere there's memorials, war memorials. It's, it's not just in Washington, D.C. Um, so I put a story, pitched for a story together to Smithsonian Magazine and said, I'm going to go. And a friend of mine who's a photographer, he's a great finance photographer. His name is UG Foote. He's the son of the Civil War historian Shelby Foote. And I said, UG and I, so he's very much steeped in war memorials. I said, why don't we go and we're going to drive around the U.S. and we're going to go to all these small town memorials and just see what they look like. Maybe this is a first draft of what a true national memorial would be. And so we went from the Northeast to one of the first war memorial to the war on terrorism is actually outside the North Church in Boston, which is where Paul Revere did his, one by sea, tour by land. Actually, I might be reversing that. It shows my bad American history. But anyways, all the way down to Mobile, Alabama, where there is a memorial, and everywhere in between. And in doing that, again, it's the sort of the role of the design advisory committee. You could see some of these memorials were very conceptual and beautiful. One was sort of dog tags arranged as wind chimes that were very haunting. Another was sort of, marble, stone, obelisk to look like the Twin Towers. And these were all small in communities. And some were just, slabs of granite with the names of the service members who died from that town. And everyone had a story. And we talked to the people in the towns who built those memorials and why they've been built. And we talked to veterans in the town who are from there. So, what does this memorial in your town square mean to you? And along the way, I obviously started, I talked to Rod Rodriguez about, what was going on with the Global War on Terrorism Memorial and how was this shaping up, and realized as much as each one of these small town memorials had a story of how they were being made, there was, an even larger mosaic of stories as to how the War on Terrorism Memorial was being undertaken in Washington, D.C. And that's sort of how I got involved.
Wow, that's amazing. And so that's a great segue to, for this memorial, for the National Global War on Terrorism Memorial, it's really important to us that we tell the entire story and that we honor all of the men and women who have served and sacrificed in this ongoing war. And as you mentioned, it is ongoing. Why do you think it's so important that we tell the whole story of the GWOT?
Well, I think like you, I'm sure I imagine the day when this memorial is unveiled and people are going to walk down Constitution Avenue or across the mall or however they decide they're going to get there, and they're going to want to come see it. And my hope is that every person who comes and sees it, they see themselves in some part of the memorial. There's some moment where they look and they say, "Oh my God, I see myself. This is, this corner of it is me, or my friend, or however it hits them like that." And I think to use it, obviously, we're doing something that's been done before, but to use an example of that is, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. One of the things that's so powerful about that memorial is when you step up to the black wall that's, so polished, what you see when you look at the names is your own reflection looking back at you. Now, I don't think we're going to wind up with a replica of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but metaphorically speaking, somewhere in this process, there should be the place where everyone looks and they see themselves or they see a friend reflected back to them. And then I think the memorial will have been successful.
And so since it's ongoing, as we've mentioned a few times, why now? Like, why is it so important that we build this memorial now?
Well, first and foremost, to state the obvious, so that there can be that moment where the people who experienced the war can come and be at the memorial, because the memorial ultimately is it's a place of healing. It's a place to come and commune with, the memories of friends. It's a place to come and for people to learn, family members, children, to connect us to, to this past. And I know you're still only, 27 years old, Jim, but guys like me who are getting old, we're getting old. So, we need to, we have to recognize too that from the perspective of our children, I have children, and this is this is history to them. So this is the right time. It's not the right time. It's the time it has to happen. It has to happen right now.
Yes.
So that's why we're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, it's a place that people can go and can gather for many different reasons. And as we've continued to talk about that internally and have heard that from others, we've started to refer to as now the future site, but ultimately the memorial as home. This will be our home. We know that this memorial will save lives. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think, home is a place where, where can feel safe, where you can feel like, you're seen and your experiences are seen, good, bad, or ugly. And I think for, anyone who has been through these wars, it's been tough coming home. And one of the things that's been tough is the wars have gone on so long that there has never been a moment where it's just over. So it's time to come home. So for so many of us, the time the war ended was when we decided it ended for us. And so that means each one of us had to sort of make a separate peace. We had to declare the
Mm.
war's over. I'm declaring a separate peace for myself. And some pieces that we make with ourselves are more enduring than others. So it's a place where you can come and have peace, have and hopefully have some of the closure um, that people need. Because listen, I'm a guy who likes books. So I'll make a literary reference here. It's often been said like there are only two war stories, all war stories are a derivative of these two original war stories, and they are Homer's Iliad and his Odyssey. And the Iliad is the story of Achilles and the Greeks going to war, and the Odyssey is the story of returning from war. So there's only two stories: the going
Mm.
to war and the returning. And so where do you return to? You return to home. So I think the hope is the closure, and I hope it's the sort of the final chapter of this story.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh. So for those who, I mean, you and I both know that when you come home, you just don't come home the same, at varying levels or degrees. For those people who haven't found their home, but they haven't found that end, or perhaps they're struggling with if their service in the global war on terrorism mattered. What would you say to those people?
I think if you come home in stages, and you
Mm.
never know when those moments are going to be when you actually finally feel like you're home. And sometimes it can be a word that you have with someone. I mean, sometimes it can be, I have children. Sometimes it can be your children telling you something about how they view that experience. But it's just to, keep trying, like keep trying to come home, and ultimately too, we bring each other home. Like this is a community of veterans. So yes, our families bring us home and welcome us back, but we're bringing each other home. And this effort is an effort, I think, by all of us, by everyone who's been involved in this memorial, whether they're a member of the Design Advisory Council, or they're anyone who picked up the surveys we sent out nationwide. And not just those who wore the uniforms, but the families of those who wore the uniforms, or civilians, who want to say what it meant for the country. Like, we bring each other home. So reach out, get involved, or when this is done, just come to Washington and take a quiet walk. I mean, that can be it, but you have to be open to those moments. So you can come home.
Yeah, absolutely. You do have to be open to them. As you know, the foundation has four tenets, which are honor, heal, empower, and unite. And I feel like indirectly we've spoken about how the memorial will honor all those who have served and sacrificed in the GWOT. We've talked about how it could potentially provide healing. We've talked about uniting, this is home. I'm wondering what you might say about the tenet of empower. Like, how do you see this memorial empowering not only those who have played a part in the GWAT, but to Americans at large?
I think in many ways it is empowering. I think the most obvious one is if you want, if a person wants to go talk about their experience, in the war on terror in Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, this gives you a place that you can go. Take your kids, walk through the memorial. So I think it empowers in that way. I think it opens up a conversation that people who serve can have, with civilians who didn't serve, and I think that is empowering. Often, too, it's very difficult to know the entry point to go back and kind of think about those experiences and allow yourself to kind of come home. And it can be tough for people to find the entry point. And I've seen that again. I write books. Like often, books can start a conversation that is really helpful and empowers people. Um, I myself have had the experience where I've said to folks, or any piece of art, like I fought in Fallujah. People sometimes ask me, "What was that like?" And I've actually been like, you know what? If you watch Full Metal Jacket, the second half of Full Metal Jacket, that's what that was like. And it actually empowers me to be able to say that because I can point to something, and maybe with the War on Terrorism Memorial, someone can say like, I don't have the words to say what this all was to me, but I can bring you here, and we can look at the memorial together, and that is empowering. So it's it gives people a tool, and I think when you have a tool at your disposal, it gives you power.
That is empowering. You referenced Dedication Day earlier in our conversation, which leads me to believe you've thought about it before. I'm wondering if you have hope, or what you hope to feel or experience the first time that you visit our memorial.
Well, I think because I, like you, have been so involved in the process, what I hope is to see it resonating with people, that people are moved by it, that they see it, and it unlocks something for them. And that to me would be the most important thing. So I guess I'm not particularly fixed on what my own reaction would be to it. I think I'm more fixed on, what I hope others will take away from it. I hope people feel something. I hope it allows them to feel something, to have a conversation, and then, and maybe if there's something difficult they're holding on to let it go, to let it go a little bit. So, that's my hope, and my hope, on that day is to maybe see the glimmers of that. But again, this isn't about it. Obviously this memorial is not about a day. It's about, it's about all the things that it's going to do for years afterwards. And that's the promise. And that's why, we're working so hard on this.
Absolutely. Elliot, it's always such a pleasure spending time with you and talking with you. As I listen to you each and every time, I'm like, man, he's saying exactly what I wanted to say, but I just couldn't find the words. I guess it's pretty amazing each and every time. My final question is just if there's anything else that you want to add about your experience as the design advisory co-chair, or just anything that we talked about today, final words.
I would just encourage, anyone listening or who is interested is that, this is your memorial. So, get involved and understand that this journey isn't over. It might never be over, but the memorial, I think, too, will be an important way station. And it's not just something for vets. It's something for our kids. It's for our families. This isn't something some small group of veterans is doing for themselves. This is something we're trying to do for everyone, because the war affected everyone and still affects everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Elliot, for spending your time with us today. I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Always. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Elliot. Welcome Home is produced by Jennifer Blum, Holly Soria, and me, Jennifer Ballou. Our operations manager is Henry Howard. Art for Welcome Home is by Minerva Consulting. Our theme, A Place Like Home, is by Birgensen Lundberg via Epidemic Sound. Mixing and editing is by Jennifer Blum. Thank you to Tango Alpha Lima Podcast and the American Legion for their collaboration on this inaugural series. You can find their episodes, guests, and more at legion.org/Tango Alpha Lima. You can find out more about the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation, get updates on the National War Memorial, and learn how you can get involved by following us on your favorite social media platforms or by visiting GWOT Memorial Foundation.org.